I'm very happy to have Toby Young on the phone today, talking about one of his big projects he's launched. Hello, Toby.
Hello.
So you founded the Free Speech Union. So that's something that I think is very necessary at the moment. But can you tell me more about how a Free Speech Union works and what made you found it?
I describe it as a non-partisan mass membership organisation that stands up for the rights, the speech rights of its members. I helped set it up in February of this year. Already we've got more than 3,000 members, and we try and defend the speech rights of our members in a number of ways. So if an outrage mob comes after them on Twitter or Facebook, we will try and encourage our members to leap to their defence. If they're kicked off Twitter or Facebook, we will write to Facebook or Twitter to try and get them reinstated. If they lose a job because of something they've said in the workplace, if they've simply been exercising their lawful right to free speech, we'll go to bat for them. If they're no platformed at a university or in the public square in some form, we will try and defend their speech rights. And if they need to go to law, we have a legal advisory council, and through them, the Free Speech Union can provide, in some circumstances, not in all circumstances, but in some circumstances, pro bono legal advice. And if there are going to be large costs involved in defending yourself in the courts, we can help you fundraise to pay those costs. So we're trying to be as creative and as innovative as possible to think of ways to defend the speech rights of what are, for the most part, ordinary people who have been punished, persecuted, are suffering in some way simply for exercising their lawful right to free speech.
Yeah, but ordinary people would think, okay, how many victims can there be? I think of professors who are not allowed to speak anymore at the Oxford Debating Club, for example. So I suppose for the normal people on the street, that doesn't seem to be a big problem. I think you had a different impression, did you?
Well, I had quite a tough time. Yes, I was appointed to a minor role on a new regulator in England, a higher education regulator at the beginning of 2018. And because my politics are right of centre, lots of people in the higher education sector objected to my being appointed to this new regulator and started trawling through everything I'd said or written dating back to 1987 to try and find evidence that I was an unsuitable person to be in this role. And because I'd been appointed by Theresa May, then the Prime Minister, it became a kind of political hot potato. And it was a kind of scandal that led the news for about 8 days. Questions were asked in Parliament. A petition was started on change.org calling for me to be fired. It got over 220,000 signatures. I had, a journalist from The Guardian, Britain's most liberal newspaper, camped on my doorstep. I would have taken him a cup of tea, but I'd run out of almond milk. I, in the end, stood down after 8 days of being mobbed in this way, and naively thought that would draw a line under the affair and I could just go back to getting on with my life. But that's like throwing a hunk of raw meat to a shoal of piranha fish. So that just got the bloodlust of the mob up, and they started writing to all my other employers, all the other charities I'm involved with, demanding that I be fired by them too. And I ended up having to step down from 5 positions in total, including my full-time job running an education charity. I even had to step down from the charitable board of the various schools I had set up, all of which are charities. So my life was effectively destroyed. I was well and truly cancelled by an outrage mob, merely because I have dissented in the past from various progressive orthodoxies. And one of the reasons I wanted to set up the Free Speech Union is because when I found myself in the crosshairs of the mob, there was no one obvious to turn to, no one to turn to for good advice, PR advice, legal advice, no one to turn to for psychological support, because it can be psychologically very traumatic to be pursued by, a blood-crazed mob who want to tear you limb from limb. So part of the thinking behind the Free Speech Union is to provide people who find themselves in the position I found myself in 2 years ago, with a support network that can advise them what they need to do in order to defend themselves if they find themselves in that situation.
Yeah, that sounds like hell. It opens a window in my mind that people are effectively destroyed, but then nobody notices that they have been. Yeah, so people just sink into oblivion and nobody cares.
One of the arguments that people who don't think that we are in the midst of a free speech crisis make is they say, well, lots of prominent people are targeted for cancellation, like Jordan Peterson, for instance, and it doesn't stop them becoming best-selling authors, going on speaking tours in which they sell out huge concert venues. So what does it really mean to describe them as being cancelled? It just seems to help their careers, if anything. And I think whilst that may be true for a tiny minority of high-profile individuals who run afoul of mobs on social media and in the academy, for the most part, when most people are cancelled, when the mob comes after them and gets them fired, they don't come back from it. They don't recover.
So I'm happy to find you aggressive enough to have defended yourself. Yeah, so I think a rather normal reaction is a sort of depression where people can't go out of the house anymore. And I'm very happy that you are the person who says, no, I'm not going to have it anymore. And I even found an organization. How do you cope? I mean, it sounds like hard work all day long. How many people help you?
We've now got enough members, dues-paying members, that we can afford to employ some part-time members of staff. So I've got about 4 people I'm employing, all working part-time. And I also have an advisory council, mainly academics, maverick academics, but also some journalists and some quite senior lawyers on the Legal Advisory Council who are pro-free speech and who are prepared to help me write letters of complaint to various authorities when they overstep the mark and censor people. So I've got. I mean, one thing that surprised me actually is how willing people are to help. It's almost as though there's an army out there, or there was an army out there waiting to be summoned, waiting for the trumpet call, an army of people willing to defend free speech. And they seem to be gathering under this banner, which is really encouraging.
What struck me most when I heard and listened to you about this thing with, I think with Peter Whittle it was, where you described that there is a legislation in England. I mean, we're on the same track here in Germany, but it seems to be further with you, that hate speech crime, non-criminal hate speech, that's I think it's called, has really taken on in England, meaning that anybody can complain about you uttering hate speech and then you're going to be listed with the police. Is that true?
Yeah, that's broadly right. The technical term is non-crime hate incidents, which sounds like something that George Orwell would have come up with in 1984, but it's real. So, as you say, if you for instance misgender someone on Twitter, the person you've misgendered can complain to the police and accuse you of having committed a hate crime. The police then investigate, and if they've concluded that your offence isn't so grave that you can be prosecuted, but that nonetheless you have crossed a line, they record what you've done as a non-crime hate incident, and that goes on your record. And if you then apply for a job as a teacher or a carer, and your prospective employer carries out a check on you whereby they can see your police record, it's called an enhanced DBS check over here, that could mean that you don't then get a job as a teacher or a carer because you've effectively got this on your record. And you might think, well, how many people really end up with non-crime hate incidents on their records? Well, the Daily Telegraph, a conservative newspaper in Britain, did an FOI request and found out that over the past 5 years, 120,000 people in Britain have been investigated by the police and have been put on their records that they've committed non-crime hate incidents. Now, by my reckoning, 120,000 over the past 5 years is about 66 people a day the police are investigating for misgendering people on Twitter, essentially, nothing worse than that, which is extraordinary, particularly when you consider that, you know, auto theft, burglaries aren't really investigated anymore by the police. We're in the midst of a knife crime epidemic, or at least we were before we were all placed under virtual house arrest by the government to deal with this pandemic. So the police really, you know, they've got lots of much better things to do, and they're always complaining about cuts and not having enough money. Well, you know, if you've got limited resources, stop investigating thought crime and investigate actual crime.
I think it's a real scandal, considering how aggressive people can get when they learn that you are on the wrong side of society. Yeah, meaning when you misgender somebody, and even willingly so, these people assume that you are evil. You're not only not okay with gendering, but you are an evil person by doing so. And we have a similar problem now with the coronavirus, that people who are critical of the measures, the lockdown, everything, they go to the street at the moment in Germany. They take to the street and have demonstrations, as you stated yesterday in your blog, a sign of hope, but still the media treats them as if they were mad or evil.
Yes, it's. I think it's been a characteristic of all human societies, dating back to the beginning of human history. I think that when people dissent from the prevailing orthodoxy, when they challenge the conventional wisdom, when they're courageous enough to ask difficult questions and challenge their leaders in particular, it annoys people. People find it upsetting and discomforting, particularly the powerful. And so they'll do what they can and have done, you know, for over 2,000 years to silence those people. And we do have various protections in place in liberal democratic societies like England and Germany to protect dissenters, to protect free speech, but they are constantly being eroded. They need to be constantly nurtured and watered, because otherwise they wither and die, these rights, these valuable rights. And, you know, we've seen how willing people have been across the Western world to forfeit their precious liberties in order to protect themselves from this deadly virus. And the willingness of people, and I've been quite impressed actually by the protests in Germany, by the emergence of Resistance Germany 2020, which I gather has already got, as a political party that's been an anti-lockdown political party that's already got over 100,000 members. There isn't anything quite like that yet in the UK, and I've been very impressed. We think of ourselves as, you know, freeborn Englishmen who will fiercely guard our ancient liberties, some of them dating back to the 12th century. You know, we think of ourselves as a nation of sturdy yeomen who won't be bossed around, and we think of the Germans as these kind of, rule followers, pinched and hidebound rule followers who are very reluctant to challenge authority. Well, it turns out the English have completely gone along with the suspension of their ancient liberties, but the Germans seem less willing to put up with it. So I've been very impressed by the reaction of a lot of Germans to the attempts by the German authorities to imprison them in their homes. I think quite unlawfully, but that remains to be seen.
There is a perfect split going through society here. one half of the society, most of them actually more on the left side, because divisions are not as sharply drawn anymore as they used to be. But you have one very law-abiding half here, people telling you off in the street when you're not wearing masks and stuff, you know. So they are very German in the truest imagery sense of the word, and the other half is protesting. So there is a perfect split here.
Yeah, we don't see that split so much in the UK, at least not yet. Most of the opinion polls find that something like 70% of the population have found the experience of being effectively imprisoned in their homes a positive one. And only 11% have found it to be a negative one, which is absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I guess it helps that the government is paying people, for the most part, to remain at home. And, you know, we're naturally quite indolent. And if you're paid to kind of eat potato chips and watch Netflix, then lots of people are going to love that.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to the next set of measures. I'm on the more heavy side, you know, I'm over 100 kilograms, so a little on the fat side. I've listened to Boris Johnson when he said that obesity seems to be one of the reasons for corona, and that something has to be done about that. So now here I'm waiting for this wave to come over to Germany, and I'm very curious what the measures against the fat people will be.
Yes, I mean, it's not as if there hasn't been a war on obesity, you know, unfolding over the past 25 years in Britain. This is nothing new. And one of the ways in which Public Health England, which is the main public health authority in England, and which is responsible for overseeing the NHS. One of the things that's emerged from this crisis is that they were completely unprepared for a pandemic, in part because they devoted so much time to things like tackling obesity, tackling smoking, encouraging people to exercise more. They actually they found time, I think, in March to publish a report. You know, almost at the height of the pandemic, Public Health England published a report bragging about how they'd met their equity, diversity and inclusion quota this year. It's like you would think that in the midst of a health emergency, they would have had better things to do than to virtue signal about diversity and inclusion across the NHS. But no, that was their priority.
Yeah, the media is concerned here with the problems you will have with your holidays. So we are facing a very big economical crisis. A lot of people will lose their work. I personally think that we might be at the brink of a crash. But the media is concerned with the problems you face with your holidays that you booked in Mallorca.
Well, yeah, that's an issue for us too, because one of the things the government has proposed is that when it has eased some of the lockdown restrictions, it's eased a few so far, but not very many. We're still in, I think, the first phase of the easing of restrictions. I think in phase 2, they're going to introduce quarantining, whereby every new arrival at an airport or a port into the UK has to quarantine for 14 months. But the policy is already beginning to fray around the edges. Apparently it doesn't apply to French people because Macron asked Boris to make an exception for the French. And I don't think it applies to business travellers either. But for people who want to go on holiday, people who've booked their holidays, it's a huge disincentive to leave the country because they worry that when they come back into the country from Mallorca, they'll have to spend 2 weeks self-isolating. And having spent, the past 3 months almost self-isolating, I don't think anyone relishes the prospect of self-isolating any more than they have to, except for the 70% who've been enjoying it.
Yeah. So to me it seems like a wave of puritanism. It started with climate, change. It went on with racism and genderism and all these identity politics things. Now we have the disciplinary effects of a pandemic that might not be just as dangerous as they make us believe it is. What is happening, or what is your prognosis? How will we carry on this year with all these things that ask from us to be disciplined and...
I do think that what we're witnessing is a resurgence of Puritanism, not just in Germany and the UK, but across the Anglosphere, certainly in the United States. I think it's less pronounced in Catholic countries like Spain, Italy, South America. And one reason for that, I think, is that it does seem to have its roots in the Christian Puritan tradition, in nonconformism. One of the curiosities, I think, of the present day is that even though across the West we are less religious than at any time in the past 1,000 years or so, nonetheless, some of the residue of that religious sentiment is still floating around, and it seems to kind of express itself in much more toxic forms than it does when it expresses itself through organized religion. And so I think what you see with the woke purity police is an intolerance for intellectual dissent, an intolerance for their own nostrums, their own political ideology being challenged, and a desire to expel, to other those people it perceives as a threat to their hegemony. And I think it's reminiscent of witch hunts and witch burning in Salem in the 17th century Massachusetts. And one of the shortcomings, I think, of the new secular Puritans is that at least Christians, when they decided that someone was a sinner, at least there was a path back into society. If you could atone for those sins. Jesus died for our sins, so that was a way of allowing sinners a pathway back into respectable, polite society. But there is no equivalent mechanism for the kind of current Puritans. Once you've been expelled, once you've been outcast, once you've been judged to be a sinner, a heretic, that's it. There's no way back. You're beyond the pale, and you should just shrivel up and die, as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
I think one of the reasons that the Puritans have got us on the run is because we are naturally quite ornery, disagreeable, quarrelsome people. We have a problem with authority. We don't like being we're not joiners. We don't like being members of organizations on the whole. We prefer to be outside the establishment, throwing stones at the windows rather than inside, pointing down at the kind of rabble. And so we've effectively conceded quite a lot of territory to the Puritans, who are much happier to organize, to form themselves into ranks, and they don't mind hierarchy. And I think what we need to do is we need to start organizing ourselves if we're going to fight back, if we're going to defend our rights, if we're going to defend the space in which we live and operate. And that's why we need more organizations like the Free Speech Union.
So the conservatives are the rebels, and the progressives are the Puritans. Yeah,
that's actually become starkly apparent during the current coronavirus crisis. In political science, it's a cliche that one of the reasons some people are conservative is because they have a more developed disgust reflex than liberals. We're supposed to be, as conservatives, more frightened of disease, more easily disgusted, more easily repelled by threatening outside elements. And that's supposedly why we don't like immigrants and why we want to close our borders, because we're worried about infection, about pathogens invading our society. We've got this overdeveloped sense of disgust. Well, it turns out, actually, that's true now of liberals and progressives, and not so true of conservatives. And you can see that in their willingness to surrender all our ancient liberties in order to protect themselves from this pathogen that's invaded our society, coronavirus. And it looks as though conservatives on the whole, it doesn't perfectly skew, whether you're pro or anti-lockdown, doesn't perfectly skew along liberal conservative lines, but there's quite a lot of overlap, quite a lot of correlation. And I think that reflects the fact that conservatives now have a less developed sense of disgust, are less easily freaked out by the possibility of pathogens and contamination than liberals. And quite a lot of the intolerance for intellectual dissent you see amongst, the woke is a kind of fear of moral pollution. And you saw that with the cancelling of Jordan Peterson when he was employed as a visiting fellow by the Cambridge Divinity School to come and give a series of lectures at Cambridge last year. That appointment was rescinded. He was cancelled when someone circulated a photograph of him standing next to a fan wearing a T-shirt which proclaimed him, the fan, to be a proud Islamophobe. And that idea that you can be morally contaminated by standing next to a toxic individual, it's almost as though, Jordan Peterson's sin was not to wear the equivalent of a face mask when standing next to this kind of alt-right young man. That kind of sense that they have to protect themselves from moral pollution, from being contaminated by bad ideas, that seems to underpin a lot of the intellectual intolerance that is a characteristic of kind of the woke thought police. So you see, I think, actually, that kind of overdeveloped disgust reflex seems to have migrated from the right to the left, which is an interesting development, and I think has become starkly apparent during the coronavirus crisis.
I'm very happy that at least there are some people like you, Toby, who have become active, because I feel that the Conservatives have for a very long time just stared passively at the developments. So I'm very grateful that people like you do something about it. There's one organization, the freespeechunion.org, is it? Free Speech Union?
That's right, freespeechunion.org, yep.
Yeah, where we can join as Germans as well. I myself am a member already. And I also recommend a look at your new website, the lockdownskeptics.org. Yeah, Lockdown Skeptics. I'll put it down on the website. It's always worth a look. And also very much work, as I can see. So I suppose you have no free minute anymore, have you?
Well, no. Running the Free Speech Union and trying to summarize the daily torrent of information about the virus is taking up a huge amount of time. There's just so much new information emerging about the virus every day. Scores of academic papers of preprints to kind of sift through. Though I think the trend is clear. The evidence just seems to be becoming greater and greater that lockdowns are likely to end up costing more in terms of loss of life than the loss of life they prevent. And that's just in public health terms, without considering the devastating economic consequences that they're likely to have.
How does your wife cope with your workload?
Yeah, my wife is pretty patient and long-suffering. But we have 4 children. We have 4 children aged 16, 15, 12 and 11, and they're all being homeschooled at the moment, not by us, but by their schools who've put programs in place, and they're kind of, they're on Microsoft Teams every day trying to be educated. And I've kind of left that to my wife, and so she's getting more and more angry about having to make sure my children are at their screens and do their homework, as well as cook meals for all of us, kind of twice a day. So today, for instance, I had to cut the daily update on Lockdown Skeptics from its normal kind of 6,000 words to 2,000 words, so I could go on a walk with my wife and the children in Richmond.
I consider myself, following your column in The Spectator, of course, I consider myself a little bit as a sort of parallel existence here in Germany, because I might be a bit heavier than you, but I also have no hair, glasses, 4 children and a dog. So, Toby, thank you very much for this interview. I wish you all the best and good luck with your work.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.